So you're saying that in the early aughts, we saw a Greenspan basically dropping interest rates and juicing in many respects the returns that were coming from the housing market. And then in 2004, we entered into a slightly different phase.
Yes, exactly. This is really one driven by private label securitization and mortgages. So this is the classic subprime phase. And that's very sharp, very sudden. It results in about $1 trillion worth of lending. And that's the bit which then ultimately tips very suddenly in 2007 into crisis mode. It would, however, not have led to the comprehensive crisis that we saw in 2008 if it had not been for the fact that over a longer time horizon, really back to the 1980s and early 1990s, banking globally had moved to a model of banking funding, which was based on wholesale markets and the financing of fixed income assets. And it's really that, the combination of the two things, the surge in subprime from 2004, funded through a model which had been developing since the 1990s, which relies on this short-term money market-based funding. It's a combination of those things together that produces the possibility of 2008.
So our avoidance of that situation could have either been a function of changing the broader context of our financial markets, or preventing that sort of, I guess, injection of like a high wire act in 2004, essentially, right? That the securitization on steroids.
Yes, I think so. If all hands had been on deck on the regulatory side from 2004 onwards, it's possible that they might have been able to suppress some of the really low-quality subprime securitization that goes on. The risks that needed to be worried about were not really, not even the countrywides or the Washington Mutuals. What caused systemic risk was the fact that, this stuff was accumulating on the balance sheets of the Citigroups and the Lehmans, which had the massive networked interconnection with the entire financial system. So it's one thing if your mortgage lenders, specialized mortgage lenders, go bad, which is what happened, say, in the savings and loans crisis of the 1980s. It's quite another if keystone commercial banks, high street banks, or keystone investment banks are entangled in that same mess. And the other thing, I guess, that would have had to have happened to contain this is global regulation of banking of a much tighter variety of the type that we have now with what's called Basel III. So a much closer attention to both the capitalization of the banks to increase their ability to absorb losses and liquidity, in other words, their ability to withstand runs of funding. And those have really been the key centers of attention in global bank regulation since the crisis.
To broaden out a little bit, what was the what were the narratives that the sort of the broader narratives that either in Europe or in this country that people had been operating under, like broad misconceptions that I guess 2008 sort of upended in many respects?
Well, I think that the most obvious one is the idea that markets and private actors, businesses in markets, can be expected to adequately insure their own risks by way of various types of derivative product. And this was fundamental to the laxness of banking regulation before 2008. The assumption was that the best risk models were the risk models that the banks themselves operated, because they knew best. They had obviously an interest in not self-destructing. And so surely to goodness, if one simply followed the best practice of the banks, then all would be well. And that clearly turned out to be a profound miscalculation. More broadly, I think what we've had to come to terms with is the fact that the fate of big private actors cannot be separated from the fate of the entire economy. This is the too big to fail problem. So not only are private actors not really capable of fully assessing the risks that they face, but when they make mistakes, if they're of a sufficiently large type, it has ramifications for everybody, which forces us then into public action of an unprecedented type. And so there you have a whole interconnected set of assumptions that really have come unstuck. And, if you go back to somebody like Greenspan, when he was asked in 2007 who he was going to vote for in 2008, he simply said, it doesn't matter who I vote for because we're fortunate enough to be in a world in which is basically governed by markets. So it doesn't matter who is the chief executive of the United States. It doesn't matter who the president is, except for foreign policy, except for security policy. And that obviously is the sort of the most fundamental delusion that was really blown apart by 2008.
There's a big whoopsie after that, it seems to me. All right. So let's talk about those political the implications. I mean, in this in Europe, in some respects. Well, let's talk about the political ramifications and the decisions that were made and the implications. Let's start in this country, and then we will move around the globe.
Well, I think in the US, what you see is this stark disjuncture, right, between a relatively effective technocratic management of the crisis itself, which, given its epic scale and the dangers that were involved, is quite remarkable in its own right. And by the summer of 2009, the immediate risk to the cardiovascular system of the United States economy has passed. The banking system is not fixed, but it is on the mend. And the real economy begins to recover from the second half of 2009, in part because of stimulus action, in part because of the recovery of confidence, the fact that things stopped getting worse. So that's, as it were, one side of the ledger. But on the other side of the ledger is the fact that the party political system as we know it is showing signs of coming apart at the seams, basically. And you began to see that already in the summer of 2008. And it's most visible, and it's very consequential, obviously, all the way down to the present inside the Republican Party. Because at the height of the crisis in the summer and fall of 2008, a Republican presidency, struggling to contain this crisis, cannot get the votes of its own party in Congress to support the bailout of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or TARP, the instrument they use to recapitalize the American banks. And it relies essentially on the opposition in Congress, the Democrats, to do the deals that are necessary. And in 2009, with Obama in the White House, you then have this extraordinary kind of combination of both absolutely bloodthirsty partisan opposition in Congress by the leadership of the Republican Party, and an insurgency at the grassroots in the form of the Tea Party, which already has many of the elements of the alt-right, which have spiraled down to the present. And then on the other side of the divide, as disillusionment with the Obama presidency really sets in, by the fall of 2011, of course, you have the Occupy movement, which I take to be symbolic of a much broader disaffection of the left wing of American politics with the entire spectrum of mainstream parties in Washington. And so in that respect, this sort of triple, on the one hand, as it were, technocratic management, but then fraying of the ability of either the Democrats or the Republicans to contain these tensions, that really, I think, marks American politics and shapes the 2016 election.